Changing gears now. While many of us are enjoying a nice holiday meal, an estimated 200,000 people in Somalia, half a world away, are on the brink of famine. Now I can hear you say, "Thanks, buddy. That really makes my hamburger taste great." Well, sorry. I'm not bringing it up to ruin the holiday mood, but rather to tee up an interview that I did with someone who's trying to make a difference there. I know you're a person who cares about what's happening in the world, and this really has not received that much coverage. It is important, though. It involves the Ukraine war and COVID and drought. Sean Granville-Ross works for Portland-based Mercy Corps. He's the Africa Regional Director. The group is in Somalia now helping people out, but there's so much other stuff going on in the world, this issue is being overlooked. Sean was in Portland recently, and so I got to sit down and talk with him.
All right, good. Yeah, so Somalia is in a pretty tough situation right now. The country and the region more broadly, the Horn of Africa, we haven't seen rain for 4 consecutive rainy seasons. And the forecasts are the 5th one, due later this year, is likely to also fail. So right now you're in a situation where the country has struggled for the last couple of years with political situation of elections, government infighting. Somalia is a federal state, so you have the federal government and then you have the states. So there hasn't been necessarily a governance structure in place. Somalia is also a place with Al-Shabaab and the inevitable challenges of conflict. And so plenty of poor and vulnerable people who primarily are livestock is the primary economic driver. Once you have no rain, then you have drought, then you have limited rangeland, limited fodder. People started initially migrating in search of fresh pastures and water, but with the consecutive rains, we've then begun to see animals dying. People basically lose their livelihoods, and then themselves start to migrate into displaced camps. The more visual ones are around the bigger cities, Mogadishu, Kismayu, Baidoa. And so there we're now seeing larger numbers of displaced people who've lost everything.
And does this mostly affect then the people, the rural folks who are out on the land as opposed to the urban dwellers?
Yeah, mainly it's the rural folks, right? The poor and the vulnerable who've been impacted already by conflict, right? And the breakdown of economic opportunities, the provision of services. So you already had vulnerable people that are sort of struggling with their livelihoods, and then their livelihood is really susceptible to sort of the changes in climate, drought, rainfall, critical to their livelihood.
Which makes people desperate, and maybe it's the reason that groups like the terrorist group that you mentioned are active, and we always hear about the Somali pirates taking on ships off the coast there.
Right. Yeah, so, conflict and sort of the complexity of the conflict of Somalia is definitely just going to be exacerbated by these sorts of situations where you have drought and people who have lost everything are then going to inevitably be even more vulnerable.
And how often do the rainy seasons come? Is that once a year?
So there's a long rains and a short rains. In Somalia they took the Gu rains, which are the long rains, right? And so those normally fall September, October, November is the long rains. And then we have the short rains in the beginning of the year, February, March, April.
So when you say so many rain seasons have been missed, is that, how many years is that?
That's now 2.5 years. And then in Somalia, like much of the world, but certainly in Somalia, right, it's the perfect storm right now. We had COVID, we have a drought, and then we have the compounding impacts of the Ukraine conflict and the increases in fuel prices and commodity prices. So, that just makes everything a little bit more difficult.
And why can't the government come in to help those people?
There is no government. Well, there is a government, but there is no real economy in Somalia. That's part of the challenges of a place like Somalia, right? Developing country, trying to also enable and establish the government structures and the governance structures and processes to allow the political system, the economic and the social systems to really function in those sort of places.
So how many people do you think are in danger now?
So in the Horn of Africa, if we talk about Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia, we now talk of approximately 20 million people who are hungry,
Wow.
who are food insecure, right? The exact numbers in Somalia, I don't have to hand, but what we do know in Somalia right now, the latest numbers give us about 220,000 people who are essentially at the point of starvation. The technical language, they talk about IPC 3, but IPC 5 is the point of real concern. So in Somalia, there are about 200,000. We talk about 7 million livestock have now died in Somalia. So yeah,
It's all just from lack of rain and
lack of
water.
rain. Yeah, essentially it's the lack of rain and the change in climate.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that the reason there's not been rain?
Yeah. Yes. I think what you're seeing also, right, is in the Horn of Africa, we know there's a drought cycle, and historically droughts have been on a 5 to 8 year cycle, and now we're beginning to see them happen more frequently. So the last drought was 2016, 2017. There was the 2011 drought. There was a 2008 drought. Then you can remember back into the early 80s, the 90s, the big droughts of the early 80s. Remember the famine of Ethiopia in the mid 80s. So people, those that track the numbers and look at the situation, definitely this is one of the more concerning.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine because, we have homeless on the streets here, but there's so many programs that help people that don't have anything literally to eat that it's hard to imagine that there's people dying outside of cities.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The situation in a place like Somalia and some of those life stories of where families are far from places where they can get help. They're already weak and vulnerable. They lose all their livestock. They're hungry. They're thirsty. They walk a long way. Inevitably, they even lose some of their children on the way in to try and find help.
And how does it end?
So, I think that's where the opportunities for organizations such as Mercy Corps can play their part, right? We need to meet the immediate needs of the people of Somalia, of the people in the Horn of Africa, and increasingly the humanitarian sector has got better and better at how you do emergency response, right? Provide cash to allow people to choose what they want to do, understand how we can provide water, the needs for shelter, the needs for non-food items. This situation is a little bit more complicated because of the impacts of the Ukraine conflict, the increase in prices of fuel and commodities, the market that normally we assume is present. We give people money so that they can choose what they want to buy, food and meet their other immediate needs. The market doesn't necessarily have the quantities or the availabilities to meet the needs of the people. So our emergency response needs to be a little bit more creative, both providing immediate support to the people themselves, but thinking about how we support the food traders, for example, to ensure that there is food available for the people to buy. And then I think more importantly, longer term, we need to understand how do we continue to build the abilities and the capacities of the government, the communities, the civil society, if you like, to understand how you mitigate long-term impacts of things such as drought, right?
It's interesting that Ukraine is having an impact there just like it's having an impact here.
Right.
It hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah, the Ukraine impact is worldwide. And certainly in the Western world, the impact of the Ukraine is more skewed towards fertilizer, more skewed towards increases in fuel and access to gas in Europe and all of those things. In the Horn of Africa, for sure, we've seen an increase in the fuel prices. That has an impact on everything in life and also drives up the price of not only food, but all the other commodities in the market.
And with so many things going on in the world, are you worried that this is just being ignored or overlooked?
That's been part of the challenge, right? That's why we're talking today. So the Horn of Africa and the drought has been one of those places of a bit of frustration in that organizations such as ourselves, the UN and others, we were really trying to get attention to the situation back in December, January, February, and the world was beginning to realize we had a situation unfolding of humanitarian need. Then the Ukraine crisis happened. Everybody disappeared for about 3 or 4 months. And it's only now that people are beginning to realize the world is complex and complicated, and there are a number of humanitarian disasters and number of needs across the world, right? The Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, just to name a few.
Hard to think about, but important.